Hello ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the channel. And today I'm going to go my review of WCW's World War III 1997. Starting off the evening, we're going to our first match of the night. It is the Faces of Fear versus Glacier and Ernest the Cat Miller. I thought this was a good matchup, back and forth matchup between both teams, with the Faces of Fear keeping the pace of the match. But Meng ultimately applies his Tonga Death Grip on Ernest Miller. And your winners of the match are the Faces of Fear. Hats off to the Faces of Fear for getting the win in that matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is Disco Inferno versus Saturn. I thought this was an okay matchup. Back and forth matchup between Inferno and Saturn, with Saturn keeping the pace of the match. And Saturn ultimately hits the finish on Disco Inferno, pins for the 3. And your winner of the match is Saturn. Hats off to Saturn for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is Yuji Nagata versus Ultimo Dragon. I thought this was a good matchup. Back and forth matchup between Nagata and the Dragon, with Nagata keeping the pace of the match. Ultimo Dragon hits a Frankensteiner on Yuji Nagata, but the Ultimo Dragon goes for a back suplex. Yuji Nagata ends up countering this move, pins for the 3. And your winner of the match is Yuji Nagata. Hats off to Yuji Nagata for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is for the WCW Tag Team Championships. It is Steven Regal and Dave Taylor versus the Steiners. I thought this was a good matchup. Back and forth matchup between both teams, with Regal and Taylor keeping the pace of the match. Regal lands a multiple European uppercuts on the Steiners. Rick Steiner then hits a power slam on Dave Taylor. Steiners, though, ultimately hit the finish on Regal and Dave Taylor. Pins for the 3. And your winners of the match, and still at that time WCW Tag Team Champions, are the Steiners. Hats off to the Steiners for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is a Raven's Rules match. It is Raven versus Scotty Riggs. I thought this was a good match. Back and forth matchup between Raven and Riggs, with Raven keeping the pace of the match. Raven then hits a Sinister DDT on Scotty Riggs. Raven then asks for a microphone. Raven then asks Scotty Riggs why he didn't want to join the flock. Then Raven ultimately hits another DDT on Scotty Riggs. Referee counts to 10. And your winner of the match is Raven. Hats off to Raven for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is Alex Wright versus Steve McMichael. I thought this was a good matchup. Back and forth matchup between Alex Wright and McMichael, with McMichael keeping the pace of the match. McMichael hits a 3-point stance on Alex Wright, and then Steve McMichael ultimately hits his signature tombstone pile driver on Alex Wright. Pins for the 3, and your winner of the match is Steve McMichael. Hats off to Steve McMichael for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is for the WCW Cruiserweight Championship. It is Eddie Guerrero versus Rey Mysterio Jr. I thought this was a great match. Back and forth matchup between Guerrero and Mysterio, with Guerrero keeping the pace of the match. Mysterio hits a Hurricane Rana on Guerrero for a near fall. Guerrero then gets up, lands multiple European uppercuts on Mysterio. Mysterio then hits a springboard moonsault on Guerrero for a near fall. Mysterio then hits a springboard Hurricane Rana as well, but Guerrero ultimately gets up, hits his signature frog splash off the top rope, pins for the 3, and your winner of the match is Eddie Guerrero. Hats off to Eddie Guerrero for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is for the WCW United States Championship in a no disqualification match. It is Ric Flair versus Curt Hennig. I thought this was a great matchup as well. Back and forth matchup between Flair and Hennig, with Flair keeping the pace of the match. Flair and Hennig both exchange in the middle of the ring, with Flair applying a figure 4 leg lock on Hennig. But Hennig ultimately grabs the United States Championship belt, hits Flair in the face with the belt. Hennig then goes for the cover, pins for the 3. And your winner of the match is Curt Hennig. Hats off to Curt Hennig for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is the main event of WCW's World War III 1997. It is the Battle Royal matchup. It was a good match, solid matchup. Nash actually came to the ring dressed as Sting. He ends up eliminating the Giant. Hall is in the ring with Kevin Nash, and Hall ultimately gets the win due to the elimination from Kevin Nash over the elimination that Nash had on the Giant and eliminating the Giant out of the match, which gave Scott Hall the win. A couple things I'm going to say about WCW's World War III 1997, man. Number one, I'm not a big fan of the concept of WCW's World War III. I was never really a big fan of that pay-per-view. I did like the concept. I thought it was cool, at least, that WCW incorporated three, not one, but three rings in the arena. Number one, I thought that was kind of cool. It brought in a whole different dynamic to pro wrestling with having three rings in the arena. But as far as that, man, some of the matches on here were just not, they were kind of lackluster, if you honestly ask me. Disco Inferno versus Saturn, lackluster in my honest opinion. Yuji Nagata versus Ultimo Dragon, again, both legends, but, you know, how many times are we going to see Yuji Nagata versus Ultimo Dragon? Raven versus Scotty Riggs, it was a solid matchup. It was halfway decent. I really wasn't a humongous fan of the Raven's Rules matches. Now, Raven as a superstar, I thought that the character was absolutely awesome. Just really wasn't a big fan of the Ravens Rules match because, in my honest opinion, it was like a mix-up between a last man standing match with a no-holds-barred match, pretty much. That's what you're pretty much getting out of that. Alex Wright, Steve McMichael, again, solid match, but again, how many times are we going to see Alex Wright face off against Steve McMichael? The matches on here that I actually did enjoy was Eddie Guerrero versus Mysterio for the Cruiserweight Championship. Solid matchup. Obviously, two guys that gel in the ring perfectly together with Guerrero and Mysterio. They put on a hell of a match for Halloween Havoc of 1997 that year, and it was a fantastic match. It was a championship versus mass match. But at least for World War III, for WCW, we got the Cruiserweight Championship on the line between Guerrero and Mysterio. That was a solid match. Ric Flair versus Kurt Hennig for the WCW United States Championship. Solid match. Two Hall of Famers, two absolute legends. But Hennig ended up becoming victorious in this match and retaining at that time the United States Championship. And then obviously the main event, the Battle Royal, where Scott Hall became victorious in that match with the help of Kevin Nash. Just like I do with every single one of these pay-per-views, you guys know by now, I always give these pay-per-views a rating from 1 out of a 10. 1 being the absolute worst, 10 being the absolute best. I'm going to have to give World War III 1997 for WCW a solid rating of a 5 at best. But this is my review of WCW's World War III 1997. I hope you guys are out there staying safe. Be careful, and remember, stay classic. Peace.